Good morning. I hope that you had a good week. I know I say that all the time, but we've been through another one and it's been good. We've got some things working out better for us as we go. Hopefully, we'll be able to get out more. Hopefully, it won't be long before we get to see each other again, or at least be able to, gather in some small groups. And then I know we'll be looking for a time when we'll be able to gather together as a congregation. I'm just glad to be here with you. I'm glad that you join me every week. And I hope that as we go through this material, we look at the book of Daniel, we're bringing some light to what he's trying to tell us. There's a lot of mystery here. There are a lot of questions that we still continue to ask, but we plug through it and plow through it. I think the reason we should read Daniel is the same reason that the author of Revelation told us to read it. He said, "Blessed is the one who reads the words of this book." And since there's so much in Revelation that's like Daniel, I think we can apply the same thing. What we want to do today is look at the next lesson. We're going to be looking at lesson 9. We're going to be looking at chapter 7, or excuse me, chapter 8. You'll see here in a second. We're looking at chapter 8. And the title of this lesson is A Glimpse of the Future. We're looking at Daniel 8, 1 through 27. Last week was Back to the Future. This week is A Glimpse of the Future. What we're going to see is some overlap between what we saw last week, at least in theme. Tremper Longman, in his NIV application commentary on the book of Daniel, indicates, like I indicated to you, that whatever you see in one chapter, you're going to see have the similar meaning and similar application in other chapters. You just have that continuing unfolding of the book of Daniel. We saw that narratively in chapters 1 through 6, where we saw individual faithfulness demonstrated, and then also God's faithfulness to his servants. Here we see it on a grander scale, a more cosmic scale, on a longer temporal scale, and we see that played out. As we mentioned, what we see in the book of Daniel at this point is apocalyptic. I won't go through all of what that means today. We did that last week. But I just want to remind you that what we're seeing here is Daniel having these various dreams and visions overlapping with the time that he spent with the kings. And so we're going back in time. We'll see what the time frame for this lesson is. And then, of course, what he's going to be doing is he's going to be seeing dreams and visions of things that happened in his lifetime, will happen shortly after his lifetime, and then into the future as well. So as we get started, I just want to let you know that I know that many of you are reading the lesson on your own. You've noticed that I don't always cover the material in exactly in the same way as it is in the book, but that just gives you a little bit of variety there. There are a number of things that you'll glean from the textbook. If you have the student guide, there are a number of things in application that I think you would enjoy, and I hope you are reading that if you have that with you. We're going to be looking at lesson 9. And it's called A Glimpse of the Future, as we said. The ram and the goat. Last week's lesson dealt with 4 creatures, very strange creatures, showed you images of a literal picture of what those would be. And of course, we recognize those as symbolic of kingdoms. We're going to see in Daniel 8 today, the ram and the goat. These also are going to be representative of kingdoms. What we're going to see is that the book of Daniel is going to give us a little bit more detail. We're going to get a little bit more understanding of the interpretation from the vision, someone in the vision himself, and we'll get to see a very famous angel in the chapter as well. What I want to do is show you an outline like we did last week. We have Daniel chapter 8. The setting is verses 1 to 2, and we'll get the temporal timestamp. We'll get when this happened, and then we'll get a little bit more of prelude to the vision by where the setting will occur. Then verses 3 through 14 will be the vision proper. We'll get to see the ram and the goat and how that plays out. And then in verses 15 to 26, we'll see the interpretation. Notice this time I didn't put quotation marks around it. There's still a lot that's left to be interpreted, but at least we get some specific information from the interpreter for us this week. And then again, we have Daniel's reaction. Very interesting reaction in verse 27. I just want to read the first couple of verses, and then move through a couple of slides, and then we'll put the camera back on me. But you want to see that Daniel gives us the information about when this vision occurred and what he is seeing to start. Chapter 8, verse 1, in the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. So what we see here is a reference to the fact that this vision occurs 2 years after the previous vision, but he mentions that previous vision. And of course, we know that happened in chapter 7. And now we're told where he goes. Some suggest that maybe he went to that place. Many others suggest no, it's just in his vision that he went to this place. I want to show you a map. What you can see here is a map of the Middle East, and you can see the major players in the ancient Near East. We're told that Daniel went to Susa in the province of Elam, and you can see there in the middle of the map there, Elam, and the general boundaries there. You can see in north of that, the Medes, south of that, the Persians. And then to the west of that, Babylon. North of us is Assyria and Sumer. You see the big players there. But I want you to see exactly where it is that Daniel goes. He went from Babylon to Susa. And as you can see there, that arrow, that's as the crow flies, as people say. It's about 220 miles. I actually did a Google map, and they were able to show the ancient place of Babylon, which is a city called Hilla today. And then Susa is a little bit smaller than the city of Shush, but it's right next to it. It's built on the same spot. And so I did just a general measurement, and most of the commentaries are right. It's about 200 miles. What this one said, when I did a straight line map, it showed about 222 miles. But you get the idea. What happens here is Daniel, in his vision, is taken out of Babylon into a region that will be the groups that will eventually take over and defeat the Babylonians. So you can see it's about 200 miles. What's curious is that tradition has it that Daniel's tomb is in the city of Susa, and I want to show you that. You can see here the shrine. There's a courtyard there, and in the background, you can see the shrine, and you can go inside there, and I didn't pick any pictures of that. It looks like it's out in the middle of nowhere, but from that angle, you really can't see. If you were to look beyond the walls, either behind you or to the sides or past the shrine there, you will see that it's really in the middle of a city. And it's not far from an actual river, and that might be the Ulai Canal that was mentioned in the text. And many would suggest that the canal itself was something man-made. But this gives you a chance to get a little idea there. That it's kind of curious that you would have the shrine of Daniel or the tomb of Daniel there, but it's today more of a Muslim shrine. Of course, it's in a Muslim territory. I think that's all I want to show you there. Let me go ahead and come back and put the camera on me, like you want to look at me that much. But what you have there is at least a reference to Daniel and a tradition going back to a reference to him and some way of honoring him. Whenever I see those, I think, if we were to open it up, are we really going to see Daniel there? What are we going to see? Are we going to see bones? We're at a position now where we can check all of these sites if they claim to be that person. Someone's made that claim, we could go and look. I think about Peter and Paul in Rome, and there are places around the world where others are buried as well. Well, you can see then we're getting a little bit of the time, we're getting the geography, but what's significant, of course, is the vision itself. And I want to read the vision. And when I do, what I want you to think about, is think about the literal thing that's going on here. We talked about the way images were used in apocalyptic literature. We're going to see that again. If you have familiarity with the interbiblical period, the kinds of things you're going to see here are going to be the kinds of things that those who know interbiblical history will recognize as these images being fulfilled in those events. Now, let me rephrase that. What you're going to see is that what they know of the events that occurred in the interbiblical period are portrayed very clearly in this text. It becomes even more clear and closer when you look at the latter part of the book of Daniel. But let me read for you, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit. Daniel says in verse 3, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns. And as I said, listen closely to what's going on here. Picture in your mind. He says there was a ram with two horns. It was standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other. The other one that grew, but it grew up later. So there was a long horn, but then a longer horn grew up later. He says, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. Now an animal could not stand against it, not one animal, and none could rescue from its power. In other words, it was able to defeat every animal it encountered. No one could defeat this ram. And then notice this word here. It did as it pleased and became great. We'll stop here for a second. What you're going to see here is a reference to the greatness of this creature, the power of this creature. And the reason I bring that up here is with each ensuing animal and with each ensuing event, you're going to see the same theme come to mind. You're going to have the same ideas brought up over and over again. Verse 5, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged it in a great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the long horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens, or host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of all the Lord's people. He's asking, when will all of this occur? And then the other one spoke and said, he said it to me, Daniel, recalling that the question was asked by one holy person, but the person answering speaks directly to Daniel. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. I hope that you listened closely and thought in your mind what was going on. One of the things we do in New Testament surveys, we always do the interbiblical period leading up to that. And the reason for that is we were able to talk about all the things that changed between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because when you go from Old Testament to New Testament, there are a lot of scene changes. There's a whole new environment, different people, the Jews look different and so forth. But what's happened in the interbiblical period has led to all of that. And what I always do is talk about, what are the things that occurred in that time period that in many ways makes Paul say in Galatians 4:4, when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a virgin, born under law. What took place during this time that led this to be the perfect time for Jesus to come? And we talk about Greek history. We talk about the Jewish independence that arose after that. We talk about Roman rule that occurs and under which the Jews find themselves in the New Testament. But one of the things we talk about is Alexander the Great and his spread of Hellenism, the fact that he dies very young, and that his 4 generals, over a period of time at least, gain control of 4 different regions that he had created. And immediately as you read this, you think of the horn, Alexander the Great, and then you think of the 4, the Diadochi or the Diadokoi, depending on how you pronounce it, his generals take over and rule. And then you have another horn that grows up, starts off small, but then gains in power and strength and has a direct event or a direct impact on the Jewish people. And what you're going to see there, as many suggest, that this is Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. You'll see all of that taking place here. And where am I getting all of that? Well, part of that is the interbiblical history. The other part is when we read the interpretation, we'll see some very specific things. So one of the things I pointed out is that as you read the text, you're going to see great power. You're going to see the fact that no one can take control or be rescued from them, that they will magnify themselves. We saw that first with the ram. The goat comes along and begins, and we'll see this in the next text as well, that he begins to glorify himself and exalt himself and magnify himself and make himself great, to the point here in the text that it says not only does he take over what you see in the land, but he even rises up to the host of heaven. And some would suggest at that point what you see is Daniel's vision transferring from something that is going on earth to being transferred in a battle in heaven. We're not going to get into all of that. There are many things you can read about that. There are many videos on YouTube and on the internet that you can watch, people giving their various interpretations. Some take only the historical approach. We're going to do that mainly. Then there are others who see Daniel as doing nothing more than predicting the future. We'll see why when we look at what takes place in the second half of this text. A couple things to note. One, when we get here, the vision is different in the sense you only have two animals. But the other thing is we have two animals that at least we can recognize. Now, they're altered. They seem to be deformed in some way, but we can recognize a ram and a goat. We're told that the ram had two horns. One had a long horn, and then, excuse me, one of the horns was long, and then the other one grew longer. We'll see what that means in a moment. But you have an asymmetric kind of ram. Then you see a goat coming. He flies, it seems. What one commentator says is that the idea that he never touched the ground was that he just moved swiftly. And we do think about Alexander the Great moving very swiftly. We'll see that here in the next text as well. But notice the idea there. One thing that's deformed about the goat is he has a horn coming straight out of his head, right between his eyes, we're told. I didn't post any pictures. I figured you'd seen enough pictures, but I wanted you to think about your mind's eye today and put this into practice and put this into your own thoughts. But then the other thing about the goat is that it started to gain other horns. The big horn broke off, 4 other horns grow up, and then there will be another smaller horn start to grow as well. Notice that we see the ram, very powerful. The goat comes up, and I think it's interesting what it says in verse 7. Came up beside the ram, and then became enraged with the ram, and then struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns. And then we are told that the ram had no strength to withstand the goat. Just as there was no one to rescue anyone from the fury and the strength of the ram, now there was no one that could rescue the ram from the goat. So you see a number of those parallels there. After this, the goat magnifies himself, becomes mighty. As we said, that large horn breaks, and then you have 4 very conspicuous horns. You see a goat walking around with 4 horns, you'll recognize that that's rather conspicuous. Notice even this much, though, beyond that, not only the 4 horns, but the way they're described. They're described as growing toward the 4 winds of heaven. What's curious about that is we saw in a previous vision that these animals that rose up out of the sea, there was also the winds from the 4 directions. So I want you to think about chapter 7 there. And when I say that, I want to stop at this point and say, as we've gone from vision to vision, we are seeing some overlap. We're also seeing some new kinds of things, but we're seeing a couple things that are more specific. We'll see in the second half of the text. But we're also seeing moving a little bit further, some more details that are given. We're seeing going further into the future, as I said. Always keep in mind the fact, too, that Daniel gives that interpretation in chapter 2 to Nebuchadnezzar, the statue of the 4 parts of the statue that had 4 different materials. Those were 4 kingdoms. You're seeing that played out a little bit here. We saw the 4 kingdoms last week. We see 2 kingdoms here, but it's prelude to what will come down the road. And so I think what Daniel's doing here is when he stops down and talks about the power of the goat and what seems to be something kind of supernatural going on there, what we're seeing in the goat is kind of a prelude to the kind of fury and animosity you're going to see rise up against God and his people in different periods of time. Now, I don't want to make that completely symbolic, but I do want us to see that as we talked about last week, there are times when these refer to specific historical events, but they have a type for what will take place in the future. So verse 10, it says he grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the stars to fall to the earth and trampled on them. So we're seeing the power that's going on here. I won't talk about that until we get to the second half, but I just want you to see what's going on. We're going from something that was somewhat real, in the sense that these animals defeated each other, but now we have an animal that is no longer focused just on earthly things, but is focused on heavenly things. And I think there's a way to look at that. We'll see that in a moment. But again, the idea of he magnified himself. To what extent did he magnify himself? To the point where he would consider himself equal to the commander of the host. And in this context, as you'll see, I think what we're dealing with here is God is being brought into the picture, the commander of the host. Host here is typically language for the angelic beings. Sometimes it blends in with who the people of God are. But what we're seeing here is an affront, not only to human kingdoms, but an affront to God's kingdom. And I think what we'll see here is that this is playing out something that still took place in an earthly way, but with heavenly language. So as I said, as you're thinking about this one who rises up against God's people, if you're familiar with your Old Testament, your interbiblical history, many will suggest that this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Well, and I say many, virtually everyone does. It's a matter of what takes place beginning in verse 10 and following. Is there some shift that occurs? I think a question that comes to mind for me when I look at this text and you move into chapter 12, it talks about a transgression or a rebellion. And the question there is this the people of God rebelling and that's why this is taking place? Or is this rebellion something that is being perpetrated by the goat? And Tremper Longman in his commentary moves in that direction a little bit more. We do see there are times when God's people are rebellious. In fact, they're in exile at the time of these visions. But in the future, from the standpoint of this text, that's not what's going on. These are people that we can see are trying to live out their faith for God in the interbiblical period, but now they're being attacked. And what we see here is this attack from this king that is causing and wreaking havoc on the people of God. And so the rebellion there, the affront there is more, I think, from the perspective of the goat going up against God. Then the vision shifts. We go from the ram and the goat to now there are two people, two individuals. They're called holy ones. And what Daniel sees is one talking to the other. And in verse 13, you can see one holy person or one holy one speak, and then the other one speaking, only this time he speaks to Daniel, as you'll see in the response. The question is a familiar one. How long will it be for the images in this vision to be fulfilled? We'll see the answer that's given in a moment. But what I want you to think about here is language that we find in other places in the Old Testament. We see it in the Psalms, Psalm 6:3, 13:1-2, and 25:17. Those are just a couple of examples, but these open up with how long? When these verses contain the phrase, how long? How long do we have to struggle? How long do we have to wait? Here the question is, how long will it be that the sacrifice will be over, that the transgressions are going to continue? How long will it be regarding the holy place? And you find the answer in verse 14, and this is a discussion for debate as well. The one answering speaks to Daniel and says, it will be 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now the question is that talking about 2,300 days or 2,300 offerings? If it's days, then of course we're talking about a long period of time. Anyway, you want to do the math, 365 divided by 2,300, it's over 3 years, or 6 years. However, because the tradition was that they had morning sacrifice and evening sacrifice, the 2,300 morning and evenings would be a reference to 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. So that would be 1,150 days. And that gets you to a little over 3 years. The question, of course, is what do we do with this language? We saw last week that what was going to be occurring later in the vision would take a time, times, and a half a time. And some would say, well, that's a year, 2 years. and a half, 3.5 years. This looks like a little bit about 3 years. Later, we're going to be looking in the book of Daniel, and we're going to see reference to 70 weeks. We're going to be seeing other references to time as well. And the question is, what's going on with these times? What does this mean? Are we supposed to make something of these very specific kinds of things? Now, times, or times, and a half a time doesn't sound like, a year. It could be. Some of them doesn't sound very specific, but some of them see it as a year. Here we see days, or mornings and evenings, or evenings and mornings. It's hard to say what that is. I will stop and say this, though. Notice that he says evenings and mornings. It's a standard Jewish way of reckoning time. You see that even in as early as the book of Genesis. There was evening and morning the first day. So it was already put in that Jewish mindset, that Jewish way of dividing days. It's really difficult to say. I do want to key in at the very end of our lesson in our application to consider what this is saying without being very specific, because I'm going to be very hesitant in coming up with detailed descriptions and definitions of what these times are. You have all of you have heard what has been done with these numbers in the past. I would caution against some of that, but I do think that we should take them seriously. I really do believe that what's in the text is there for a reason. We need to know why that is. We need to continue to look at that. But what we do see is after that time is over, there will be the restoration of the holy place. The two holy ones then are speaking to each other, and then they're actually then interacting with Daniel. So in his vision, Daniel goes from being in Babylon, transported to Susa, and there are images that people have put together. They've drawn these pictures of Daniel kind of separated, and then you see a river representing the Ulai Canal, and then as he's watching, we're kind of behind him looking forward, you see the ram and the goat fighting each other, and then you see the destruction of the ram and his horns taken off and so forth. Now we see, after the battle of these two animals, two individuals talking, and that's going to lead us into the interpretation. And so we get the image, and now we get the interpretation, verses 15 and following. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. Let me stop there. It says he's watching the vision. He's trying to understand it. It's kind of curious, though, that whenever Daniel is presented with a dream, he can interpret it. Now we're seeing a situation again where he's having visions. He doesn't know what they mean, and he's asking for their interpretation. So he's seeking to understand what it means. And then you have this mysterious situation. You have the two holy ones talking to each other. Then you have someone like a man speak, and speaks directly to Gabriel. Now, it doesn't say whether Gabriel is one of those two that is standing there. Maybe that he comes from another area. Some have suggested that this voice, like a man speaking the directions to Gabriel, could be God himself. He speaks to Gabriel and says, tell the man the meaning of the vision. And as you read this, if you're following along, if you've never read this before, you're like, oh, good, we're going to get an interpretation. Verse 17, as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. One of the things that comes to my mind here is kind of like what you see in the book of Revelation. You see it in other places whenever a figure who is a messenger of the Lord, which is the definition of angel, speaks to someone in the Bible, they always fall down. They have respect. There's a sense of fear and awe there. We have the same thing here with Daniel. And then Gabriel says to Daniel, Son of man, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. And at this point, this is one of about 2 or 3 places in the text where it talks about the vision concerning the time of the end. Some will break it down this way. They'll say what you see at the beginning with the ram and the goats, those are 2 kingdoms fighting, but that at some point this goat and this reference to the goat transfers from human kingdoms to some kind of end time scenario in the cosmic realm. Of course, the cosmic realm meaning God battling Satan, and the Antichrist rising up against people, as many will say. And again, Daniel hears Gabriel say these very words, this concerns the time of the end. Well, up front, let me just say time of the end could mean the time of the end of that kingdom, what takes place with this uprising against God and his people, or it could mean time of the end, meaning the end times, the end of the age. It's hard to say. As I've said before, sometimes you're going to have this typology where something takes place historically that's true, but still has application and is preparatory for what we see taking place at the end of time. You see this throughout the Old Testament regarding Christ. Um, Joseph is a type of Christ. David's a type of Christ. Joshua is a type of Christ. You see the tabernacle is representative of the dwelling of God among his people. Jesus is fulfillment of that. There are a number of types. Doesn't take away the historical reality of what took place, but it's saying these things had importance in their time, but they had reflection into the future. And that may be what's going on here. I want to be a little bit more open-ended about that because I think there's a larger message that we can draw from this, regardless of how you do that. And I know when you do that, it sounds like you're just trying to skirt the issue altogether, and really not. I think I want to respect the Old Testament in the genre that it is, this apocalyptic language, and then keep in mind how much of this is referring to what would soon take place after Daniel. Keep the historical context there, and then as the text in the New Testament allows, then we can bring in some of that. So what happens? Verse 18, as Gabriel is speaking, he says, while he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Now, I don't know about you, but if an angel's talking to me like that, I really would find it difficult to fall down and go to sleep. Who knows? I don't know if this is something that's a regular occurrence to him or not. Maybe, again, as we said last week, there are certain ways that he acted within the vision, even though he knew it was a vision. Let me give a quick side note here. I know I just kind of blew past discussion about Gabriel. It's kind of curious that we've known about angels visiting God's people or different people throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. This is the first time an angel is actually mentioned by name. We see it here twice in this chapter, and with Gabriel. And then Gabriel is not mentioned by name again until Luke chapter 1, when he announces to Zechariah that he is going to become the father of John the Baptist. And then that same angel, Gabriel, appears to Mary. The angel is mentioned in Matthew speaking to Joseph, and the Magi we're not told their names. We are going to see also later in the book of Daniel reference to the angel Michael, and he's going to be mentioned a few times. He'll be mentioned a couple of times in the book of Daniel, chapter 10 and 12, and then he's going to be mentioned again in Jude, in the middle of the letter there, as well as in the book of Revelation. Curiously enough, as another side note, the reference to Michael in Jude is Jude quoting an extra biblical text called the Assumption of Moses. That's not taking away the reality that Michael exists. We already see it here in the book of Daniel, but we also see that in the book of Revelation as well. But you have these two named angels there. So you have this reference to Gabriel by name. And as I said, kind of curious how Daniel can just fall asleep. I don't know what's going on there. Gabriel pulls him, lifts him up, and says in verses 19 and following the interpretation of the dream. He says, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath. So he's talked about the time of the end. Now he's calling it the time of wrath. He says, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. There it is again. But now he tells us what's going on in verses 20 and 21. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media or Medes and Persia, the Persians. So you have a long horn, the Medes. The longer horn is the Persians, because the Persians came and took over reign from the Medes, and they lasted longer. Think about Daniel listening to this. He is a Babylon. He's in Babylon. He has already interpreted a dream for Nebuchadnezzar some years prior, that there will be these kingdoms that come. The dream that he interprets just represent types of strength with iron and so forth, gold, iron, silver, clay, but none of the vision there, none of the dream there when Daniel interprets this does he say what kingdoms they are. We can discern what kingdoms they are looking back. Here, though, we have a specific reference. Daniel, as a servant of Babylon, hears that the Medes and the Persians are coming. Then you have in verse 21, the shaggy goat. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. And then in verse 23, before I come back and talk about a couple things here, in the latter part of that reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. And in some texts, you're going to see verses 23 and following almost in poetic form. It'll be set off in a different way. But let me come back and talk about a couple things we see in the text here. First, shaggy goat. Some translations will say, well, most of them that I see, modern translations will say shaggy goat. I find that curious because he says it in such a way as if that's the way he'd already been described, but he hadn't been described that way. Some talk about him being just the he goat. Other translations, like the King James, says rough goat. The rough goat. Well, it surely was rough because of the way he beat up on that ram. But you see that reference there. Notice also it says very specifically Greece. In doing some of the reading and background here, I mean, as clear as this is, it's a wonder that anyone will ever think otherwise. You see very clearly it says Medo-Persian Empire followed by the Greek Empire, and yet you're going to see people take up other meanings for this, at least in terms of seeing this, well, maybe it happened then, but it really is talking about the end times. I was looking, and one person said, well, the Hebrew says Yavon. And therefore, it's just a general term. Obviously, the Hebrew word doesn't have what we call Greece. It would have another reference. But he says it's just a kind of a general reference to the areas in the West. And so I thought, okay, well, we can see what's going on there. His reason for saying that modern translations say Greece is that scholarship, liberal scholarship, has taken over. They see Daniel only as a late letter. They don't like the fact that Jesus quotes from Daniel, because if he quotes from Daniel, that means it has to be understood historically, and they don't. Well, let me backtrack for a moment. When Jesus quotes it in reference to some things in the future, they don't like the fact that Jesus is making some interpretation of the future. They see it only as something taking place during the interbiblical period. And so what this guy said was that the word for Greece was imported, and it was put there by liberal scholars who want to take away the historical accuracy of the book of Daniel. They don't want to see it as prophecy. They just want to see it as something that was recorded after the events. Well, here's the problem with that. He said liberal scholarship since like the 1900s. The problem with that is that the word Greece or Grecia is used in the King James Bible. So if we just do English, the King James Bible predates this for this liberal scholarship by a couple of centuries. But we can go even further back than that, because what we can do is we can go back and look at the Greek Old Testament, which was produced almost a couple of hundred years before the time of Jesus. And in the Greek Old Testament, it says the word Greek. It gives the Greek word for Greece. So I don't know, why he feels like it's so wrong to say Greece at this point. Everything else that we're going to see in here fits very clearly with what we know that took place in the interbiblical period. And when we get in chapters 10 through 12 specifically, we're going to see a lot that is very, very clearly representative of what took place in the interbiblical period. So, Greece, this is the Medo-Persian Empire followed by the Greek Empire. This is Alexander the Great, the big horn, that great big horn, the first king. Then that king is broken off. We do know that Alexander the Great died at like the age of 33 years old. So even as he gained power very quickly and spread his kingdom very quickly, he died very young and rapidly. Doing so without any succession plan, without anyone who would follow after him after he would pass away. He's young. He's not thinking about successors at this point. He's still thinking about expanding his kingdom. So he doesn't have the proper leadership in place. And as we said a few minutes ago, what you have taking place then is there is a battle. Some of Alexander's children try to reign, but they're taken over, they die out. And so you have four of Alexander's generals take over. You have the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids that would take over this region and part of the Syrian Empire. And then you'd have Lysimachus and Cassander taking over Asia Minor and the Greek and Macedonian peninsula. That would take place in the interbiblical period. Those are the four kings. What you then see take place is in verse 23, in the latter part of the reign, the rebels become more wicked, and a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. So you have these four horns, and then another horn is going to come up. And when you see the description, you're going to recognize this as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He rises up out of the Seleucid dynasty. And we do know from biblical or interbiblical history and the book of the Maccabees that what happens is he becomes the most fearsome enemy against the Jews in this time period. Won't recount everything that takes place there, but we'll talk about a couple of things. What I find interesting is we actually get an interpretation. We actually have something specific here. Now, there's still a blend of some other rather unreal kinds of things that occur, but we have specific names: Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the Greek Empire. This is the kind of thing, though, that someone would say, see, this is just proof that Daniel was written at the time that these things were occurring, not hundreds of years before. And we say hundreds of years before, we're talking about 300 years before, 200 to 300 years before that. Still, it's quite considerable, but it's nice to see an actual interpretation. Moving forward then, what do we see about this one that rises up against against the great king, this fierce-looking king that is a master of intrigue arising? Notice what is said about him. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. Many suggest then that what's going on here is, I'll say it, they say it, I'm not saying it here, but it's a good parallel. This is where they're saying this is Antichrist and beast being empowered by Satan. He's doing this not under his own power. I think another way to look at it is to say clearly that if this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes coming up against God's people in the interbiblical period, that clearly this is someone who is being empowered by Satan himself. He's got, similar to what took place with Judas, who was influenced and embodied by Satan, as the text might say. Here you have something similar. It's as if clearly this person could not have done this on his own. Notice it says in verse 24, then he will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper and will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. You see that there's, again, language here that suggests something on a cosmic scale. Could be that it's taking place historically with cosmic language, but I think there's a type that's being presented here. Notice then what's said at the very end of verse 25. He will stand up against the prince of princes, yet he will be destroyed. And then notice the counterbalance to the fact that this king rose up and was able to destroy, but not with his own power, not by his own hand. Notice the language that's used to describe his own destruction. He will be destroyed, but not by human power. Very much what's going to take place is the people of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, are going to rise up against Antiochus IV, and they are going to rebel against him. We do see what Antiochus does in the interbiblical period, and I know I keep saying that phrase. He sets up the temple as a place to worship Zeus. He refuses the Jews the right to practice their various holy days and festivals and sacrifices. And what many would call the abomination that causes desolation, that we see more specifically referenced later on in the book of Daniel, is when Antiochus actually has pigs slaughtered in the temple. You talk about spitting in the face of God, rising against the holy ones of God, and basically rising up to heaven, if you will. This rebellion that Antiochus has against God through the people of Israel is the highest and most heinous acts of blasphemy against God. And what we then see then is when the people rise up against the Antiochus and his armies, their defeat through Judas Maccabeus, the Maccabeans, could be explained nothing short of miraculous. These are a disorganized people, and yet they were able to rise up and to have victory. So we see that in kind of a snapshot. The text then ends with this reference to the closing of the vision in verses 26 and 27. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given is true. You get the sense this is still Daniel, or excuse me, Gabriel talking to Daniel. It's true, but he's then told, Daniel is told, seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. And there again is a reference to something in the future, whether it's distant in the sense that Daniel's not going to see it because it's 3 kingdoms away, or if it is prelude to something even greater than that. What I want you to see is the fact that we have yet again a reference to Daniel closing something up. He ends up writing it down, and we're able to see it and read about it. But for his time, he seals it up and doesn't bring it up. Notice then the conclusion here. A similar thing we saw last week at the end of chapter 7. We see it here. But there's something else going on. Verse 27, he says, I, Daniel, was worn out. Can you imagine? He says, I lay exhausted for several days. Notice again, this vision he's participated in has worn him out. He was disturbed and distressed at the end of the other vision. Fortunately, I guess if you want to say it that way, this one's is 2 years later, but he's now distressed again. He's exhausted. There's the parallel then to the middle of at the end of the vision itself, before the interpretation, he fell asleep while Gabriel is talking to him. Now he's distressed, or excuse me, exhausted again. He fell asleep, he rested, and he just was exhausted for several days. And then the last thing it says is this, which I find it encouraging, and we'll make application of it here. He says, then I got up and went about the king's business. And he says, lastly, I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. He says he was exhausted. He returned, though, after a few days to the king's business, but even continuing to think about the vision, he was astounded by it. It was beyond understanding. No one could explain it. What's going on? What do we see here? Well, again, we see a vision like we saw in chapter 7 with an interpretation. We get a little bit more clear interpretation here. We don't give time frames, but we do see groups. I think if you're Daniel and you've already interpreted a dream to the king Nebuchadnezzar 2 kings ago, because now he's under King Belshazzar, he's already told the king there are going to be other kingdoms that follow you. So Daniel's already ready, already recognizing that the kingdom of Babylon is not going to last. I think for Daniel, the question is he going to die before the new kingdom comes along? The fact of the matter is he's not going to die. Daniel's going to see part of the fulfillment of this. He's going to see, he'll see the rulers of Medo-Persian Empire in his own day, because we'll see that next week and the following week when we see him have a vision during the time of Darius and then during the time of Cyrus. So he lives to see the Medo-Persian Empire take over Babylon. But he's sitting there knowing that these things are temporary. Notice what he does, though. While he's still troubled by the vision, he goes about the king's business. He goes about doing his job. He's still worried in the sense that he's wondering what this all means. Doesn't know when it's all going to take place. He doesn't know the time. He still doesn't understand all the details of the vision that he has seen. But what we're going to see is Daniel go about his business. And so at this point, I want to stop and bring in an opportunity for us to think about some application. So let's move on and look at some application. Reflections and applications. The first thing is a question. Questions may arise. I'm only going to list one question here. I've got several that are on my notes. One question that's going to arise is, what are we to do with these prophecies? In many respects, we see them already fulfilled. We've seen the Medo-Persian Empire come and go. We've seen the Greek Empire come and go. It may be that what we saw in chapter 2 is a reference to the Roman Empire coming. Certainly, we can see some of that taking place in chapter 7. This vision stops short of that. This vision stops short and speaks solely about what takes place during the Greek rule and reign, and I think taking place that would be fulfilled during the time of the interbiblical period when the Jews were able to rebel against Antiochus IV. We're dealing here then with a prophecy that basically is fulfilled. What do we do with that? Some other questions I have was, what do we do with the prophecies and visions, which again seem to have already been fulfilled? What about studying other prophecy and apocalyptic literature in general? What's the point of it all? What do we do with that? What is the value of it for today? One question is, if so much of this was revealed back then and fulfilled back then, well, then it's just history to us. What do we do with that? I think it's a valid question. I do think we have to start there in recognizing that it is something that occurred in the past. But now we have a record of what took place in the past, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if we go about looking at this text as only being fulfilled in the distant future, even our future, then what's the value of it for the people back then? We have to keep in mind that it was written originally by Daniel for people in his generation and following, and certainly we see how this would have spoken to the people reading the book of Daniel as the events that he wrote about as a prophecy are being fulfilled in their own time. There is something to be said about making sure we take these texts in their historical context. It's particularly important given the fact that many people related to interpreting prophecy are prone to see these as referring only to end times and not at all at the time of the writer. And the problem then leads to so many interpretations. All of us have been around long enough to know that we've seen people who have claimed about prophesy, interpret scripture and say, oh, Jesus is coming back, Jesus is coming back, Jesus is coming back, only to be found wrong and changing all of their interpretations. As I said last week, this may serve as types for us. Certainly John in Revelation picked up on that. We also have to consider the repetition of the use of the phrase last days and end times, or the time of the end, in looking at this text. So we see that it's historical, referring to prophecies that would be fulfilled after the time that they were written, but there may still something be future beyond that. And I think that just speaks to the fact that even Isaiah could prophesy things and not know all the implications of them. He might have prophesied about Jesus without knowing he was prophesying about Jesus. He just knows he was prophesying about the son of the servant of the Lord. There are many things that are going on there. I do think we have to appreciate the historical value of that and then look at the future. Before I deal with a couple of things, though, in regard to some specific application, let me go back to a point that I made a moment ago. If this is solely in the past, what do we do with it? If anything, this still speaks to God's faithfulness. It speaks to the character of God. It speaks to the relationship that God has with his people. It speaks to the fact that we have the same God today as we did back then. We're fortunate that we have Christ as God in us, living in us. But it does speak, even if it's a history, it's a record of God's faithfulness to his people. These are people in the book of Daniel that are suffering exile, and yet there's a promise that God is with them, and he still has a plan for them. I'm not going to go through all the same themes that we've done before, but the one thing that I think we see taking place is we have God's faithfulness moving forward. He has a record of that faithfulness. He has a record that we can look back and say, if God is like that, he's got to be like that today. In short, when we read the letters, or we read these prophecies in their context in which we find them and with their understanding of the purpose that they have, we look at that purpose. I need to rephrase what I just said there. We need to read them in light of their historical context. We need to read it in light of their genre, which is apocalyptic, and then we have to read them in light of their purpose. What is the purpose of apocalyptic? Last week, we picked up on several themes, but the one that I want to pick up on is the fact that apocalyptic literature was designed to have people see comfort and to persevere under trial. It was a way to encourage and exhort them. What are some things then that we can think about that we could put into practice as a result? Some application. We can take comfort in God's timing. I mentioned we don't always necessarily know what time, times, and half a time means. We often don't know there are different meanings behind the 2300 evenings and mornings. There is a number of interpretations related to the 70 weeks in the rest of the book of Daniel. But the fact that some kind of time frame is given tells us this, that God has a time. There is a time for everything. And we see that in Ecclesiastes in a somewhat negative way, but it's still a realistic way. A time to laugh and a time to mourn and so forth. There's a time. What we're seeing here is that God has a plan, and there are things that he has set in place, and they will come due in the right time. We need to make sure we understand that God does have a timetable. We don't always understand what that is. Peter, taking up what the Old Testament said, that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years are like a day. God has a timetable for everything to be fulfilled. We need to trust him and take comfort that whatever we're going through, whatever trial that we may face, we know he's there and he's got a timetable. We call out to him in trust. There is a limit to evil. God will have a time when he stops, and it will come to an end. So again, he has a timetable that he's working on, and it doesn't always match ours, I know. The next thing I want you to see is we need to keep humbly seeking understanding. Daniel didn't understand. He wanted to understand. I think from another perspective, wherever there is challenge in the text, keep seeking to understand. Jesus, when he gave his apocalyptic discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, he said there are signs to be looking for. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, in trying to quell the understanding or the misunderstanding of the second coming of Jesus, when the Thessalonians thought he was going to come like right then, and they stopped working. Paul says, they need to work. They need to keep about their business. While Jesus could come at any time, there are certain things that have to take place. If you studied the lesson, you recognize that the background passage to today's lesson is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, because of some themes, there are some, though, that would suggest that the reason for that is that what Paul is talking about is a direct parallel to what we see in the book of Daniel here. But the point that Paul makes in 2 Thessalonians is we keep working. Okay, we have the signs. There are things to look for, but God has his timing. So whatever we don't understand, we can keep trying to understand. We don't stop seeking meaning. But the last thing I think we need to look at is we work until he comes. Remember what it said. Daniel was frustrated. He was exhausted and tired for a few days. Then he got up and worked. When Jesus talks about watching in the apocalyptic discourses, that's not looking up to the sky. That is working. Looking is working. Watching is working. As I said a moment ago, Paul rebuked those who decided that, in believing that Jesus was going to come back, they stopped working. He says they weren't busy. They became busybodies. They need to work. We've seen people in the past. I mentioned Tremper Longman in his NIV application commentary. He actually debated Harold Camping back in the mid-90s when Camping was predicting that Jesus would come back in 94. He ended up changing his theories again and again after Jesus didn't come back. One of the things that Longman also indicated or experienced was because of Camping's predictions, there were many who decided, and I thought a lot of this was just rumor, but Longman said he experienced people doing this. One was a person ran up his credit cards because he knew in his mind Jesus was going to come back and there was no reason to pay it back. Well, I'm thinking if Jesus is going to come back that soon, what are you spending your money on? You're not going to be able to keep those things anyway. But there were people who stopped working. They were running up their bills. They were living immorally. There's nothing to live here for. They were waiting for Jesus to come back. We know about a number of groups that have stopped working, and they've done some really crazy things thinking that Jesus was coming back right then. But one of the things we have in the New Testament is a clear directive that we work. I know our work is limited in some ways today because of COVID-19 and we can't get out. But there are works, things that we can do. We still are able to fulfill the mission and commission. We do look for that time when we can do that more openly and get out and about and do it. But the point is we work until he comes. Daniel knew there was going to come a time when the Medo-Persians would take over Babylon. He didn't stop working for his king. We still have work to do on this earth until Jesus comes back. And I just want to encourage you in that. It's something that I have to hear myself. It's something that I know that I need to think about every day. I need to keep working. I know that he's coming back. I just don't know when. We work until he comes. I hope that's been meaningful for you. I hope that You'll be preparing for worship. Um, as I said before, I'm really glad that you joined me. I enjoy doing this. I really miss you all. I look forward to the time that we'll be back together soon. Um, let's have a word of prayer. We'll just get our hearts ready for worship. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for all that you're doing. We just pray right now that um, you would help us to keep our mindset, knowing that so much crazy is going on in the world. The things seem to be out of control, but we know you're in control. We know that you have a timetable for everything, and we just need to trust you in that timetable. In the meantime, Father, I pray you give us strength and courage to work until you bring all things to completion. Thank you for Daniel and his example of faithfulness. Thank you for his example of and work ethic. He knew things were going to take place, but he kept working. I do pray, Father, that you will continue to help us seek your word and all that it means, that we will understand you, continue to seek you and worship you. And I pray now that as we get ready to go into worship here shortly, that we will just worship you in all of our spirit and truth, that you will be honored and glorified in all things. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. It was good seeing you. I hope that you have a good week. We'll see you in worship very soon.